Hello everyone. Today, walking near the destroyed fourth reactor, I saw probably the cutest rabbit in my life. But this is the zone, and all it left of him is just a shadow. This is Tina, and you are once again listening to my frequency. You know, it is surprisingly quiet out there today. It is the kind of heavy, absolute silence that makes your ears ring, as if the zone itself has decided to hold its breath and give me the time and space to tell you this story. I am sitting here in my usual spot, my small sanctuary hidden away in the damp basement of an administrative building that time forgot. The dim, warm glow of the radio equipment is the only light in this room. The vacuum tubes hum a low, comforting melody, and the smell of ozone mixes with the scent of old, crumbling paper and concrete dust. It is cold down here, the kind of damp cold that seeps right into your bones, but I don't mind it. It keeps me awake. It keeps me grounded in reality. I often wonder who is listening to this static. Maybe it is other stalkers huddled around a small smokeless fire in a dilapidated barn somewhere in the perimeter. Maybe it is someone sitting in a warm apartment in Kiev, trying to touch the ghost of this place through the airwaves. Or maybe I am just talking to the void, to the empty houses, the rusted Ferris wheel, and the whispering pines. It doesn't matter. I have to speak. I have to document this, because if there is one thing I have learned from wandering these irradiated paths, it is that memory is the most fragile artifact of all. We, the people who walk these forbidden routes, are usually conditioned to look for specific things. We are always scanning the horizon, watching where we step, looking for anomalies, checking the dosimeter, and trying to avoid the invisible, silent death that lingers in the soil. We are taught to be pragmatic, to be cold, to survive. The outside world loves to romanticize this place. They write books and make games about bloodthirsty mutants, supernatural anomalies, and heroic gunfights. But the truth of the exclusion zone is far more terrifying and far more profoundly sad than any science fiction story. The real horror is not a monster hiding in the dark. The real horror is the physics. It is the absolute, indifferent laws of the universe that tore a hole in the world in the spring of 1986. Today, my path took me far away from the usual stalker trails, past the abandoned villages with their scattered toys and rotting floorboards. I went deep. I walked right into the heart of the beast, the industrial zone, the immediate perimeter of the Chornobyl Nuclear Power Plant. I was walking near the new safe confinement, that colossal, gleaming metal arch that covers the ruins of the fourth reactor. Even after all these years, standing near it makes you feel like an insect. The sheer scale of the engineering, the monumental effort to contain the disaster, it presses down on your shoulders. The air here feels different. It feels thick, metallic. You can almost taste the lingering radiation on the back of your tongue, a dry, bitter sensation that reminds you exactly where you are standing. The landscape around the reactor is an ocean of dead concrete, twisted rebar, and forgotten industrial machinery. It is a graveyard of Soviet ambition. I was making my way along a massive, heavy concrete fence that bordered one of the old technical yards right next to the epicenter. This fence, it is not just a boundary. It is a witness. It has stood there since the night the sky caught fire. As I walked alongside it, the crunch of my boots on the broken asphalt was the only sound for miles. I studied the wall. Over the decades, it had been subjected to unimaginable things. It absorbed the immediate blast wave, the scorching heat of the burning graphite, the radioactive dust that rained down for weeks, and the relentless weathering of 40 years of harsh winters and blistering summers. Because of the initial fires and the sheer amount of soot, oil, and radioactive particles baked into its surface, the concrete is almost entirely black. It looks like the charred skin of some ancient, petrified leviathan. It is rough, porous, and dead. It is a wall of pure, solidified trauma. I was walking slowly, my dosimeter clicking in a steady, rhythmic rhythm in my chest pocket, a constant reminder of the invisible danger. My eyes were tracing the deep cracks and the dark, carbonized stains on the concrete. I am used to this ugliness. I am used to the aesthetic of total destruction. But then, my gaze snagged on something. Something that completely broke the pattern of the darkness. Something that made my heart skip a beat and forced my feet to stop dead in their tracks. There, right at the eye level of a kneeling person, on this massive, blackened canvas of concrete, was a patch of light. It was not a trick of the overcast sky, and it was not a patch of moss or peeling paint. It was a shape. An incredibly distinct, perfectly defined silhouette. I stopped breathing for a second. In this place of monumental tragedy, of steel and nuclear fire, I was looking at the delicate, unmistakable outline of a small animal. It was a rabbit. It was sitting on its hind legs, its tiny body slightly hunched, with two long ears pulled back, as if it was listening to something in the distance. The contrast was staggering. Everything around this shape, every inch of the concrete wall, was deeply stained, charred, and blackened by the history of the explosion. But the shape of the rabbit itself was the original, pale, unburnt gray of the concrete. It was as if a piece of the wall had been magically protected from the apocalypse. I stood there alone under the leaden sky, the massive arch of the reactor looming behind me, and stared at this impossible image. My first thought, the cynical stalker thought, was that someone had played a joke. A stencil, a can of spray paint, a piece of dark street art left by someone who wanted to leave their mark on the most dangerous place on Earth. But the moment that thought entered my mind, I dismissed it. No one comes here to paint. The radiation levels at the base of this specific wall would limit your stay to minutes, not hours. You don't stand here and carefully apply a stencil while your bone marrow is being bombarded by gamma rays. I stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from the concrete. I realized I was holding my breath again. I reached out, my hand trembling just a little bit inside my heavy tactical glove, and prepared to touch the wall. I needed to understand what I was looking at. I needed to know how this tiny, innocent shape managed to survive the end of the world. Part 2. The Touch and the Truth. I slowly dropped to my knees. The asphalt beneath me was jagged, broken by decades of frost and aggressive, mutated weeds pushing through the cracks. It was uncomfortable, but I barely registered the sharp stones digging into my shins. My entire focus was locked on that pale, innocent shape etched into the darkness of the wall. With deliberate, almost hesitant movements, I grabbed the fingers of my right tactical glove with my left hand and pulled it off. The cold, damp air of the zone immediately bit into my bare skin. My hand was shaking slightly, not from the chill, but from an instinctual, primal apprehension. You learn very quickly in the exclusion zone that touching things without protection is a fool's game. The dust here is not just dust, it is a microscopic cocktail of strontium and cesium. But in that moment, the overwhelming need to feel the reality of what I was looking at overpowered my training. I needed physical proof that my eyes were not deceiving me. I extended my bare hand and pressed my fingertips against the black, charred concrete surrounding the rabbit's silhouette. It felt exactly as it looked, dead. The surface was heavily textured, abrasive like coarse sandpaper, coated in a deeply baked-in layer of microscopic soot and oxidized minerals. It was the texture of something that had been violently cooked. It felt brittle, as if the very molecular structure of the stone had been stressed to its absolute limit. Then, I slowly slid my fingers across the stark boundary line and into the pale gray shape of the rabbit. The difference was staggering. The transition was so abrupt it felt like crossing a border between two different realities. The concrete inside the silhouette was smooth, relatively cool, and completely intact. It retained the original, fine-grained texture of industrial Soviet concrete poured decades ago. There was no soot. There was no carbonized grit. It was just clean. I traced the curve of its back, the delicate point of its ears, the small, rounded shape of its tail. My mind was racing, frantically trying to process the data my senses were giving me. I stood there, kneeling in the radioactive dirt, tracing the outline of a bunny over and over again. As I did, the final remnants of the graffiti theory evaporated from my mind. Paint sits on top of a surface, it adds a layer. This was not an addition. This was an absence. The blackness was not painted on, the blackness was the trauma, and the rabbit was the only place that had been spared. But how? How does a single, tiny patch of concrete survive the apocalypse while everything around it burns? And then, standing in the shadow of the sarcophagus, the chilling realization finally washed over me. The memory of old, grainy black and white photographs from 1945 hit my mind with the force of a physical blow. Hiroshima. Nagasaki. The nuclear shadows. I remembered seeing pictures of stone steps where a person had been sitting waiting for a bank to open, or a wall where someone had been holding a ladder. When the atomic bombs detonated, the flash of thermal radiation was so intensely hot and bright that it bleached the concrete and asphalt everywhere it touched. But the people absorbed that unimaginable heat. They were vaporized in a fraction of a second, but for that one infinitesimal microsecond before they ceased to exist, their bodies acted as a physical shield. They blocked the thermal radiation from hitting the stone directly behind them. They left behind permanent, haunting silhouettes of their final moments. Flashburn shadows. My breath hitched in my throat. I pulled my hand away from the wall and stared at the rabbit, my eyes wide with a sudden, crushing wave of horror and profound sorrow. This was the exact same physics. This was a thermal shadow. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the night of April 26, 1986. I tried to see it from the perspective of this wall. It would have been a quiet spring night. This small rabbit, perhaps a wild hare from the nearby red forest, or maybe a test animal that had managed to escape from a lab in the nearby city of Pripyat, was sitting right here. Maybe it was resting against the warm concrete. Maybe it was just terrified of the strange mechanical noises coming from the massive building nearby. And then, the reactor core ruptured. Before the sound wave, before the explosion tore the roof off the building and hurled chunks of radioactive graphite into the sky, there was the light. A flash of light so obscenely bright and a wave of thermal energy so unfathomably hot that it mimicked the surface of the sun. It expanded outward in a silent, blinding sphere of absolute destruction. That wave of searing heat slammed into this concrete fence, instantly scorching it, baking the dust, and chemically altering the surface of the stone into the black, carbonized mass I was touching today. But right here, in this exact spot, the thermal wave hit the rabbit first. The rabbit took the brunt of the nuclear fire. The temperature was so extreme that its biological matter, its fur, its skin, its bones, its beating heart, was eradicated in a millisecond. It didn't burn, it simply turned into vapor and ash before its nervous system could even register the concept of pain. But in that unimaginably brief moment of its destruction, its tiny, fragile body formed a barrier. It absorbed the lethal heat, casting a physical shadow of cool salvation onto the concrete directly behind it. The rabbit died to protect this patch of stone. Its instantaneous death is the only reason this perfect, smooth, gray silhouette exists. This isn't a drawing. It is a photograph taken by a nuclear explosion. It is the literal, physical imprint of a life being extinguished. I sat back on my heels, the cold seeping through my trousers, entirely paralyzed by the weight of what I was looking at. In the grand narrative of Chornobyl, the brave liquidators, the helicopter crashes, the evacuated cities, the political cover-ups, who would ever think about a single, frightened rabbit? It was a microscopic tragedy lost in a sea of monumental disaster. Yet, here it was, perfectly preserved, screaming silently from the blackened wall. The universe is terrifyingly indifferent, but physics has a way of leaving receipts. A heavy, suffocating sadness settled over me. I reached into my chest pocket, my fingers brushing past the clicking dosimeter, and felt the familiar, rough edge of my sketchbook. I couldn't just walk away and leave him here alone. Not again. Part 3, The Graphite and the Ghost. I slowly pulled my bare hand away from the cold concrete and carefully pulled my heavy tactical glove back on, sealing myself away from the poisoned dust once more. The silence around the fourth reactor was absolute, broken only by the erratic, rhythmic clicking of the dosimeter in my chest pocket. It was a mechanical heartbeat, a constant reminder that while the air looked clear and the ruins looked still, an invisible storm of radioactive particles was tearing through the space around me. I knew I couldn't stay here long. The exposure in this specific sector, right under the shadow of the sarcophagus, is not something you want to accumulate. But I also knew, with an absolute, crushing certainty, that I could not simply turn my back and walk away. In the grand, terrible history of Chornobyl, this tiny rabbit was nothing. It wasn't a firefighter who bravely stepped onto the burning roof. It wasn't an engineer who frantically tried to pump water into a shattered core. It was just a small, frightened animal that had the profound misfortune of sitting in the wrong place at the exact millisecond the world ended. History does not remember the rabbits. But the zone did. The zone recorded its final moment with brutal, photographic precision. And now, I had to record it too. I unzipped the heavy canvas of my jacket. The cold wind immediately bit through the layers of my clothing, but I ignored it. From the inner pocket, pressed close to my ribs where it stayed warm and dry, I pulled out my sketchbook. Its leather cover was cracked and weathered, filled with maps, notes on anomalies, and sketches of decaying machinery. I flipped past the drawings of rusted Ferris wheels and collapsing wooden houses until I found a blank, slightly yellowed page. Then, I dug out a simple, wooden pencil. Just wood and graphite. There was a dark, poetic irony in that. The reactor core that had exploded mere hundreds of meters from where I sat had been moderated by graphite. Chunks of highly radioactive graphite had rained down on this very asphalt. And now, I was going to use graphite to capture the ghost that the reactor had created. I sat down right there on the jagged, broken asphalt, crossing my legs and resting the sketchbook on my knee. The colossal, arching metal structure of the new safe confinement loomed over me, blocking out half the grey sky. It felt like sitting in the nave of a monstrous, abandoned cathedral. I looked at the pale silhouette on the blackened wall, took a deep breath of the filtered air inside my mask, and pressed the tip of my pencil to the paper. The sound of the lead dragging across the rough texture of the page seemed deafening in the dead silence. Scrape. Scrape. It sounded like the static on this very radio frequency. I started with the ears. I drew the long, delicate lines pulled back against its body. My hand was trembling slightly, perhaps from the cold, perhaps from the adrenaline, or perhaps from the sheer emotional weight of what I was doing. Usually, when you draw, you are trying to capture life. You are trying to capture the light reflecting off a subject, the volume, the breath. But here, I was doing the exact opposite. I was drawing an absence. I was tracing the negative space of a life that had been instantly vaporized. I didn't draw the rabbit itself. Instead, I began to fiercely shade the area around it. I pressed the pencil down hard, letting the graphite build up into a thick, dark, metallic layer on the paper, mimicking the carbonized, soot-stained concrete of the fence. I darkened the edges of the page, pressing harder and harder, creating a storm of gray and black strokes. I let the darkness consume the paper, just as the nuclear flash had consumed the world around this spot. And by making the background dark, the white space in the center began to take shape. I left the paper completely untouched where the rabbit was supposed to be. I protected that small, innocent shape on the page, just as the rabbit's physical body had protected the concrete from the thermal flash. As the dark graphite surrounded the empty white silhouette, the image jumped out at me. It was haunting. I used the side of the pencil lead to carefully smudge and blend the harsh edges, softening the transition between the black ruin and the pale ghost. My fingers became stained with the grey dust of the pencil. The clicking of the dosimeter seemed to fade into the background, replaced entirely by the hypnotic, scraping rhythm of my drawing. With every stroke, I thought about the sheer, terrifying indifference of the cosmos. The universe doesn't care about innocence. A nuclear reaction does not distinguish between a concrete slab, a steel pipe, or a beating heart. It simply expands. It simply destroys. Yet, in that blind, destructive expansion, it had accidentally created a monument. It had forced the stone to remember. I spent minutes sitting there in the dirt, entirely absorbed in the act of shading. I wanted the contrast to be perfect. I wanted the darkness to feel oppressive, so that the pristine, untouched white of the rabbit's silhouette would feel like a miracle. A terrible, heartbreaking miracle. The wind shifted, howling mournfully through the skeletal remains of an electricity pylon nearby. The dosimeters ticking suddenly accelerated, jumping to a higher, frantic pitch as a gust of radioactive dust swept across the technical yard. It was the zone's way of clearing its throat. A warning. My time in the epicenter was up. I added one last, dark stroke of graphite near the base of the silhouette, grounding the white shape in the darkness. I pulled the pencil away and looked down at my lap. There it was. The thermal shadow, Translated from irradiated concrete to fragile paper. Part 4. The Archive and the Sign-Off. I stared at the stark white shape surrounded by the frantic, dark scribbles of my graphite pencil. It was done. I hadn't captured a rabbit, I had captured a fraction of a second from the spring of 1986. I carefully blew the excess graphite dust off the page, watching the grey powder scatter into the irradiated wind. It felt like a tiny, strange funeral rite. I closed the heavy leather cover of my sketchbook and stretched the elastic band around it. The sharp snap of the band was a sudden punctuation mark in the heavy, oppressive silence of the industrial yard. My knees popped loudly as I pushed myself up from the broken asphalt. My legs were stiff from the damp cold, and a dull ache had settled deep in my lower back, but I barely registered it. The dosimeter in my chest pocket was still chattering angrily, a frantic metallic insect warning me that my welcome here had officially expired. I unzipped my jacket just enough to slip the sketchbook deep into my inner breast pocket, pressing it close to my ribs, right over my heart. I wanted to protect it from the dampness, from the poisoned dust, from the slow, relentless decay that consumes everything else out here. Before I turned to leave, I looked back at the wall one last time. The pale silhouette of the rabbit sat there, completely motionless, eternally bracing for a blast wave that had already passed decades ago. It looked so impossibly small against the towering, rusted nightmare of the power plant and the gleaming, suffocating arch of the new safe confinement. I raised my heavy, gloved hand in a silent, solitary salute. A gesture of respect to a life that had been erased only to become a canvas of stone. I turned my back on the fourth reactor and began the long walk back toward the perimeter, navigating blindly through the labyrinth of abandoned machinery, twisted pipes, and skeletal power lines. The crunch of my boots was the only companion I had. As the distance between me and the epicenter grew, the frantic clicking of my dosimeter began to slow down, eventually returning to the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the wider zone. The immediate physical danger was receding, but the heavy, suffocating weight of what I had just witnessed clung to me like invisible fallout. You see, we look at Chornobyl and we almost always see the grand narrative of disaster. We see the crumbling apartment blocks of Pripyat, the rusting Ferris wheel that never saw its opening day, the graveyard of irradiated helicopters, and the colossal engineering of the sarcophagus. We see the breathtaking hubris of humanity and the terrifying, unchained power of the atom. We talk in terms of Roentgens, half-lives, and exclusion zones. We measure the tragedy in square kilometers and centuries. But the zone is not just a monument to our colossal mistakes. It is a mirror. And it is the most ruthless, meticulous archive in the history of the world. It doesn't just preserve the concrete and the steel, it preserves the echoes. It traps moments in amber, or in this case, in scorched concrete. That tiny thermal shadow is a testament to the fact that even in the face of absolute, unfathomable annihilation, life has a weight. It has a presence. Even when a living, breathing creature is turned into vapor in a fraction of a millisecond, it refuses to be completely erased. It leaves a mark. It forces the very stones to bear witness to its existence. We are all so incredibly fragile. We walk through our lives surrounded by concrete and glass, complaining about the mundane, thinking we are permanent fixtures in the universe. But it only takes one flash of light, one catastrophic failure of the systems we built so blindly, to remind us that we are nothing more than temporary obstacles for energy. If the worst happens, if the sky catches fire tomorrow, what will we leave behind? Will we even leave a shadow? That rabbit on the wall, it is not just a ghost of the past. It is a warning for the future. It is a symbol of resilience in the most perverse, tragic way imaginable. It tells us that life, no matter how small, no matter how quickly it is extinguished, alters the universe. Even if that alteration is just a patch of unburnt grey on a blackened wall. I am sitting here in my bunker now, looking at the sketch I made. The graphite shines slightly in the dim, warm light of my desk lamp. The image is safe here with me, far away from the crushing radiation of the reactor core. But I know that out there, under the cold, indifferent, leaden sky, the real shadow is still sitting on that wall. It will sit there through the toxic rain, the bitter snow, and the slow, inevitable crumbling of the concrete, long after I am gone, long after all of us are forgotten. I will keep walking these paths. I will keep looking for the things that the world has left behind, the quiet tragedies and the hidden, terrifying miracles that the zone keeps locked away in its irradiated heart. I will keep listening to the silence, and I will keep broadcasting my voice into the static, hoping that someone, somewhere, is listening. Hold on to your memories. Hold on to your warmth. Cherish the people around you. Because in the end, that might be all that is left of any of us. A fleeting thought, a story told on a crackling radio, or a shadow cast upon a wall. This is Tina, signing off from the Exclusion Zone. Good night, everyone. And good night, little rabbit.